In the quiet hush of an ancient world, where the sun dipped below the golden horizon of the Nile, there lived a young boy named Imhotep, whose life began not with thunder, but with the soft rustle of reeds against the riverbank. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lotus and the distant rhythmic chanting of priests from the nearby temples of Memphis. He spent his earliest days watching the flow of the eternal river as it carried the lifeblood of Egypt through the parched sands of the desert. His eyes were always searching for the hidden patterns in the stars and the subtle ways the wind moved the acacia trees. His father was a master builder named Canifer, who taught him that every great structure begins with a single stable stone and a vision that reaches toward the heavens. As a child, Imhotep did not play like the others, but instead gathered smooth pebbles and arranged them in geometric shapes while listening to the elders speak of the old kingdom's secrets. He walked through the bustling markets with a smell of frankincense and myrrh hung heavy in the heat, watching how the herbalists crushed dried leaves into powders and how the builders calculated the angles of the sun. His mind was a vast library even then, collecting observations about how the body moved and why the seasons shifted with such predictable grace. The nights were long and cool under a canopy of velvet blue, where the constellations told stories of gods and ancestors. He would lie on the cool mud-brick roof of his home, feeling the earth's heartbeat and wondering if the human body was like a temple that could be repaired if one only understood its architecture. The world was slow and deliberate in those days, governed by the rising and falling of the tide and the steady pulse of the harvest. He learned the language of the birds and the silence of the desert, which taught him more than any scroll could ever hold. As he grew into a young man, his reputation for wisdom spread through the dusty streets of the Third Dynasty like a gentle breeze. He was often found sitting by the water's edge with a palette of ink and papyrus, recording the way a bone set after a fall, or how a certain root could cool a fevered brow. There was no rush in his movements, only a deep and profound patience that seemed to align with the very stones of the earth. He saw beauty in the mundane and divinity in the details of a leaf's veins or the curve of a ceramic jar. His voice was said to be like the low hum of a distant lute, capable of calming the most anxious heart. The people of the village began to seek him out, not just for his building skills, but for the way he looked at them, as if he could see the inner workings of their souls. He understood that to heal the body, one must first quiet the mind and listen to the whispers of the breath. His journey was a long path through the shadows of the great temples, where he studied the ancient scripts and the laws of Ma'at, which sought balance in all things. Every step he took was a meditation on the harmony of existence and the interconnectedness of the stars and the soil. The sun would rise each morning in a burst of amber and gold, casting long shadows over the limestone cliffs, and Imhotep would be there, waiting for the light to reveal new truths. He was a soul born of the silt and the starlight, destined to bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual. He knew that his life would be a testament to the power of observation and the quiet strength of a focused mind. As the years stretched on, he became a pillar of his community, a man whose presence was as steady as the North Star. He would often walk through the fields during the inundation, watching the water reclaim the land and thinking about the cycle of life and rebirth. There was a stillness in him that was contagious, making those around him feel as though they were part of a much larger and more beautiful design. He did not seek fame or power, but rather a deeper understanding of the natural laws that governed the world around him. He spent countless hours in the cool that emphasized balance and moderation. He became the eyes and ears of the king, watching the grain stores and the rising of the water, while simultaneously studying the anatomy of the human hand and the way the eye captures light. His presence was a stabilizing force in a time of transition, when the old ways were meeting the new visions of a unified Egypt. He walked through the palace gardens, listening to the splash of water in the fountains and the gentle cooing of doves, which he found more informative than the loud debates of the politicians. He was a man who understood that true power lies in the ability to listen and to observe the subtle shifts in the world around him. The king granted him titles that reached the ceiling of the temple, but Imhotep remained a simple servant of the truth, looking for the divine geometry in every stone and every heartbeat. He would often stand on the palace balcony, looking out over the Nile as the moon rose, casting a silver path across the water, and he would reflect on the responsibility of guiding a nation toward a future that would last for millennia. His mind was a vast landscape of ideas, where medicine and architecture and spirituality flowed together like the branches of a great river. He began to design the royal court not just as a place of politics, but as a center of learning where the brightest minds could gather to discuss the mysteries of the universe. He encouraged the scribes to record everything, from the height of the flood to the success of an herbal poultice for a cough. His rise to power was not a climb, but an unfolding, like a lotus flower opening to the morning sun. He treated the king not just as a ruler, but as a human being, subject to the same frailties and wonders as the common laborer in the fields. This deep empathy allowed him to bridge the gap between the divine pharaoh and the earthly reality of governing a complex society. The days in the court were long and filled with the steady rhythm of administration, but Imhotep found moments of meditative silence in the archives, where the smell of old parchment and dust provided a sanctuary for his thoughts. He was the one who suggested that a king's tomb should be more than a simple mound of earth, and instead a ladder to the stars made of permanent stone. This vision began to take shape in his mind as he watched the sunrise over the Saqqara Plateau, feeling the weight of the earth in the pull of the sky. He was the bridge between the king's ambition and the eternal laws of nature, ensuring that every decision was made with an eye toward harmony and balance. His influence was felt in the way the laws were written, and the way the sick were treated, and the way the monuments were aligned with the constellations. He was a man of the people who walked in the shadow of kings, but never lost his own light. The court of Djoser became a place of wonder and intellectual growth under his guidance, where the focus shifted from war and conquest to the mastery of the self and the environment. He taught the court physicians to look for the cause of a malady rather than just the symptoms, and he taught the builders to look for the soul of the stone. The air was always calm when Imhotep spoke, and even the most heated arguments would dissolve in the face of his quiet logic and profound wisdom. He was a master of the moment who understood that the present is the only place where eternity can be built. He lived a life of service that was as steady as the flow of the Nile and as deep as the roots of the ancient sycamore trees. As the king grew older, his trust in Imhotep became absolute, leaving the management of the realm in the hands of the one man who saw the world as a single living organism. He would spend his evenings walking the perimeter of the royal grounds, feeling the cool breeze on his face and listening to the distant sounds of the city of Memphis as it settled into sleep. He was a guardian of the past and a creator of the
shadows over the palm groves. He would walk through the streets of Memphis and feel the pulse of the city beneath his sandals. He noticed the way the mud bricks dried in the sun and the way the workers moved in a coordinated dance of effort and rest. He began to envision a city that was not just a collection of houses, but a living monument to human potential, where health and wisdom were the primary exports. His evenings were spent in the quiet library of the palace, where the oil lamps cast a warm and flickering glow on the thousands of papyrus rolls that contained the collective memory of his ancestors. He read of the old kings and the ancient floods and the stars that had guided the first people, and he added his own insights to the margins in a hand that was steady and sure. He was a polymath, not because he sought to know everything, but because he saw that everything was connected, and that a healer who did not understand the stars was like a builder who did not understand the earth. He saw the human body as a miniature temple that required the same care and precision as the great house of the pharaoh. He would sit for hours, watching the moon rise over the desert plateau, thinking about the durability of stone versus the fragility of flesh, and how to make the work of a man's life last as long as the mountains. His presence in Memphis was like a grounding wire that kept the city stable during times of uncertainty, and his wisdom was a light that guided the people through the darkness of illness and fear. He believed that every problem had a geometric solution, and every disease had a natural cause that could be understood through patience and careful study. The air in the Third Dynasty felt thick with the possibility of discovery, and Imhotep was the vessel through which those discoveries flowed into the world. He was a man who moved with the grace of a heron and the strength of a granite pillar, and his influence was felt in every corner of the kingdom, from the highest peak of the palace to the lowest hut by the river. He would often find himself in the royal gardens at twilight, breathing in the scent of jasmine and listening to the soft rustle of the wind in the papyrus thickets, and he would reflect on the harmony of the universe and his place within it. He was the architect of a new way of thinking, a priest of the observable truth, and a healer of the broken who lived his life in a continuous state of meditation and service. The nights were long and peaceful under his watch, and the people of Memphis slept soundly, knowing that the man who understood the stars and the stones and the blood was watching over their world. As the stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky like diamonds on a dark cloth, Imhotep would close his eyes and listen to the silence of the night, feeling the weight of the day melt away into a sea of infinite peace and quietude. He was a master of his own mind and a servant of the greater good, a man whose life was a silent symphony of thought and action that would echo through the halls of history forevermore. In the quiet shadows of the great temples, where the smoke of old rituals lingered like a heavy mist, Imhotep began to observe a different kind of truth that lay beneath the surface of the world. For generations, the people had believed that every fever and every ache was the work of invisible spirits, or the breath of a passing shadow. But the young healer sat in the stillness of the afternoon and watched the way a wound behaved when it was cleaned with the water of the river and the oils of the cedar tree. He realized that the body followed a logic as deep and predictable as the movement of the tides, and that the stars in the sky did not dictate the health of a man as much as the balance of his humors and the cleanliness of his surroundings. He spent countless hours in the cool limestone halls of the archives, reading the ancient spells, and then comparing them to what his own eyes saw in the marketplace and the fields where the laborers worked under the steady pulse of the sun. He noticed that a man who drank from a stagnant pool fell ill, not because of a curse, but because the water itself carried a heaviness that the body could not endure. He started to move away from the loud chanting and the shaking of rattles that the older magicians used, and instead he embraced a profound and meditative silence where he could listen.
Healing hands. The nights in the Third Dynasty were long and silent, and in that silence Imhotep found the answers to the questions that had haunted mankind since the beginning of time. He was a pioneer of the rational mind, a giant who stood between two worlds and chose to walk toward the light of the future with a steady and unwavering gaze. The people felt a sense of relief in his presence, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from their shoulders, because they no longer had to fear the whims of the spirits, but could instead focus on the simple and beautiful task of living a healthy and balanced life. His legacy was not built on gold or conquest, but on the quiet revolution of the thought process and the gentle application of wisdom to the suffering of the world. As the stars twinkled like distant lamps in the infinite corridor of the night, he would close his eyes and breathe in the cool air of the desert, feeling a profound connection to the earth and the heavens and the silent pulse of the eternal river that flowed through his home and his heart. The sun had just begun to cast its long amber glow over the limestone walls of Memphis as Imhotep sat within the quietest corner of the royal library. The air was perfectly still and carried the faint, dry scent of ancient dust and sun-baked reeds. He held a long scroll of fine papyrus across his lap and felt the texture of the fibers beneath his steady fingers. This was the beginning of a document that would change the course of human history, known in the distant future as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, but for him it was simply a record of the truth. He dipped his reed pen into a shallow well of black ink and paused to listen to the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city as it settled into the heat of the day. His mind was a vast and tranquil landscape where he organized his thoughts into 48 distinct cases of injury and ailment. He did not start with prayers or mentions of wandering spirits, but began with the physical reality of the human frame. He wrote with a hand that was slow and deliberate. Each character was a testament to his patience and his belief that the body was a map waiting to be read. He described the way the skull felt beneath the palm of a healer and how the brain was encased in a protective layer that hummed with the pulse of life. He was the first to look at a wound not as a curse, but as a biological event that followed its own set of laws. He categorized each condition with a clarity that felt like a cooling breeze in a fevered room. He wrote the words, "An ailment which I will treat, and an ailment with which I will contend, and an ailment not to be treated," showing a profound wisdom in knowing when to intervene and when to let the body rest in its own natural silence. The room was filled with a soft, diffused light that made the shadows of the pillars stretch across the floor like the fingers of a sleeping giant. He described the tension of the muscles and the way the vertebrae aligned like the stones of a well-built temple. He spoke of the heart as the center of the system, a master vessel that spoke to every limb through the silent language of the pulse. He recorded the use of honey as a natural barrier against the unseen forces of decay, and the use of lint to keep the flesh clean and dry. His observations were like the steady ticking of a clock, methodical and reassuring to those who sought a reason for their suffering. He wrote about the way the eyes moved when the head was struck, and how the breath changed when the ribs were pressed. It was a symphony of details that built a bridge between the physical world and the intellect. He sat for hours as the shadows shifted from the east to the west, his focus never wavering from the sacred task of documenting the human condition. The papyrus grew longer and heavier with the weight of his knowledge, a weight that was also a lightness, for it offered a path out of the darkness of ignorance.
With a racing heart, and did not see the touch of a specter, but rather the exertion of a pump that was working too hard against a blockage in the flow of life. He categorized the redness of a wound not as a mark of divine displeasure, but as a sign of the body's own internal struggle to mend itself back into a whole. The court of Memphis was quiet as the evening turned to night, and Imhotep felt a profound sense of peace as he replaced the chaos of magic with the order of diagnosis. He taught his students that the first step to healing was to remain as still as a statue and observe the patient's breath and the clarity of their eyes and the texture of their skin, for the body always tells a story if one is patient enough to read the chapters. He spoke of the hidden vessels that carried the spirit and the blood throughout the frame, comparing them to the intricate irrigation canals that turn the desert into a garden. His voice was a low and soothing murmur that could lull the most anxious soul into a state of tranquility as he explained that even the most frightening illness had a rational root and a pathway toward a cure. He spent his nights studying the way the light shifted over the constellations and realized that the macrocosm of the universe was reflected in the microcosm of the human soul, and that balance was the key to all existence. He looked at a broken limb and saw the geometry of the bone and the tension of the muscle, and he applied the same principles of physics that he used to balance the massive stones of the king's tomb. There was no room for fear in his heart, because fear was the daughter of ignorance, and he was the father of understanding. He saw that the mind could play tricks and create phantoms where none existed, so he encouraged his patients to breathe deeply and find the center of their own being before he applied his ointments and his bandages. The air in the room was cool and carried the faint aroma of cedar and honey, which he used to seal the flesh and keep the air of decay at bay. He wrote that the pulse was the speech of the heart, and that by placing a finger upon the wrist, one could hear the secrets of the entire system. He was the first to realize that the brain was the commander of the limbs, and that a blow to the head could silence the legs, not because of a curse, but because the connection had been severed in the physical realm. His rise to prominence in the court was not due to his ability to perform miracles, but due to his ability to provide clarity in a world that was often dark and confusing. He sat for hours in a state of moving meditation as he organized the symptoms of the lungs and the stomach and the liver into a system that made sense to the logical mind. He believed that the gods had given humans the intellect to solve their own problems, and that the greatest form of prayer was the study of the natural world.
The silence of the room was a blanket that protected him from the noise of the past and allowed him to hear the whispers of the future, where science would one day stand on the foundations he was laying today. He moved his hand in a slow and rhythmic arc as he sanded the edges of his medical instruments, feeling the smoothness of the metal and the strength of the design. He was a master of the mundane who found the sacred in the simple act of washing one's hands and drinking clean water from the spring. As the moon moved across the sky, casting a silver glow over the silent pyramids, he felt a connection to the eternal flow of time and the endless cycle of learning and growth. He was breaking the cycle of primitive magic, not by destroying the old ways, but by evolving them into something more beautiful and more effective for the well-being peace of the people. He knew that his work would live on long after his breath had returned to the wind, because the truth once discovered can never be forgotten. He closed his eyes for a moment and felt the heartbeat of the world beneath him, steady and strong and reliable, like the stones of his own great monuments. The world was safe in his hands because he saw it as it truly was.
Jawbone, finding a divine geometry in every curve and every angle of the human frame. His hands moved in a rhythmic motion across the scroll as he described the way the blood returned to the center to be renewed, just as the sun returned to the east every morning to start the day anew. The people of the court slept soundly, while their vizier stayed awake to unlock the secrets of their own survival, creating a manual for the healers of the future who would stand on his shoulders to see even further into the light of knowledge. He believed that to understand the machine was to honor the creator, and that by mapping the body, he was creating a map to the universe itself. The air remained still and the lamp burned low, but his focus was as bright as the North Star, guiding him through the intricate tunnels and chambers of human anatomy. He felt a deep sense of calm as the complexity of the body began to resolve into a simple and elegant system of balance and function. He wrote of the metu, the channels that linked all parts of the person, and he taught that health was the unobstructed flow of energy through these divine pathways. He saw the eyes as windows to the brain, and the tongue as a messenger of the internal state, always looking for the subtle signs that told the story of the inner machine. His mapping was a labor of love and a testament to the power of a quiet mind that refuses to be distracted by the noise of the world. He knew that the flesh was temporary, but the knowledge of its structure was eternal and would serve as a foundation for all who sought to mend the broken and comfort the weary. As the first light of dawn began to touch the tips of the pyramids, he laid down his reed pen and felt the heavy satisfaction of a man who has looked into the mirror of the soul and understood the reflection. He breathed in the cool morning air and felt the harmony of his own machine working in perfect unison with the earth and the sky and the river. His work was finished for now, but the map he had created would remain a guide for 1,000 generations of doctors and dreamers who would one day marvel at the genius of the man who first saw the body as a work of art and a masterpiece of engineering. The quiet of the Egyptian dawn was a promise of a new day, where the human machine was no longer a mystery, but a miracle that could be understood and protected with wisdom and care. He let the scroll dry in the gentle breeze and prepared to rest, knowing that the map was complete and the way forward was clear for all who had the eyes to see. In the deep and velvety silence of the Egyptian night, when the stars hung like silver lanterns over the limestone cliffs of Memphis, Imhotep sat in his private sanctuary, where the only sound was the slow and rhythmic dripping of a water clock, marking the passage of the hours. He reached out with a hand that was as steady as the foundation of a pyramid and placed his long, slender fingers upon the wrist of a resting patient, feeling for the first time in human history the secret language of the heart. It was a soft and persistent thrumming, like the distant beat of a drum across the desert or the steady pulse of the Nile as it moved the lifeblood of the nation through the irrigation canals. He closed his eyes and allowed his consciousness to drift into the rhythmic sensation, noting how the beat was sometimes fast, like the wings of a frightened bird, and sometimes slow and deep, like the breathing of the earth itself.
He realized in that meditative stillness that the heart was not merely a vessel for emotion, but a majestic engine that spoke to every limb and every finger through a network of invisible roads. He began to understand that the pulse was a messenger carrying.
In the shadows over the palm groves, he would walk through the streets of Memphis and feel the pulse of the city beneath his sandals. He noticed the way the mud bricks dried in the sun and the way the workers moved in a coordinated dance of effort and rest. He began to envision a city that was not just a collection of houses, but a living monument to human potential, where health and wisdom were the primary exports. His evenings were spent in the quiet library of the palace, where the oil lamps cast a warm and flickering glow on the thousands of papyrus rolls that contained the collective memory of his ancestors. He read of the old kings and the ancient floods and the stars that had guided the first peoples, and he added his own insights to the margins in a hand that was steady and sure. He was a polymath, not because he sought to know everything, but because he saw that everything was connected, and that a healer who did not understand the stars was like a builder who did not understand the earth. He saw the human body as a miniature temple that required the same care and precision as the great house of the pharaoh. He would sit for hours watching the moon rise over the desert plateau, thinking about the durability of stone versus the fragility of flesh, and how to make the work of a man's life last as long as the mountains. His presence in Memphis was like a grounding wire that kept the city stable during times of uncertainty, and his wisdom was a light that guided the people through the darkness of illness and fear. He believed that every problem had a geometric solution, and every disease had a natural cause that could be understood through patience and careful study. The air in the Third Dynasty felt thick with the possibility of discovery, and Imhotep was the vessel through which those discoveries flowed into the world. He was a man who moved with the grace of a heron and the strength of a granite pillar, and his influence was felt in every corner of the kingdom, from the highest peak of the palace to the lowest hut by the river. He would often find himself in the royal gardens at twilight, breathing in the scent of jasmine and listening to the soft rustle of the wind in the papyrus thickets, and he would reflect on the harmony of the universe and his place within it. He was the architect of a new way of thinking, a priest of the observable truth, and a healer of the broken, who lived his life in a continuous state of meditation and service. The nights were long and peaceful under his watch, and the people of Memphis slept soundly, knowing that the man who understood the stars and the stones and the blood was watching over their world. As the stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky like diamonds on a dark cloth, Imhotep would close his eyes and listen to the silence of the night, feeling the weight of the day melt away into a sea of infinite peace and quietude. He was a master of his own mind and a servant of the greater good, a man whose life was a silent symphony of thought and action that would echo through the halls of history forevermore. In the quiet shadows of the great temples, where the smoke of old rituals lingered like a heavy mist, Imhotep began to observe a different kind of truth that lay beneath the surface of the world. For generations, the people had believed that every fever and every ache was the work of invisible spirits or the breath of a passing shadow. But the young healer sat in the stillness of the afternoon and watched the way a wound behaved when it was cleaned with the water of the river and the oils of the cedar tree. He realized that the body followed a logic as deep and predictable as the movement of the tides, and that the stars in the sky did not dictate the health of a man as much as the balance of his humors and the cleanliness of his surroundings. He spent countless hours in the cool limestone halls of the archives, reading the ancient spells.
Into the quiet harmony of the ancient Egyptian night, in the soft silver light of a cooling Egyptian evening, Imhotep walked slowly through the temple gardens of Memphis, where the air was heavy with the fragrance of blooming jasmine and the earthy scent of wet soil following the evening watering. He moved among the rows of carefully tended plants with a sense of reverence, for he saw the entire earth as a vast and sacred pharmacy prepared by the gods for the healing of mankind. His fingers brushed against the soft leaves of the willow tree, and he thought of how the bark could be crushed and soaked to pull the heat from a fevered brow, just as the cool winds of the north pulled the heat from the desert sands. He stopped to observe the golden flow of honey being harvested from the temple hives, knowing that this liquid sunlight was the greatest shield against the unseen decay of a wound, keeping the flesh sweet and clean under its protective seal. His mind was a quiet library of botanical wisdom, where he cataloged the properties of every root and seed and flower that grew along the fertile banks of the Nile. He understood that the blue lotus could bring a peaceful sleep to the restless, and that the crushed seeds of the poppy could silence the sharpest pain, allowing the body to drift into a state of restorative stillness. He spent his afternoons in the cool shade of the apothecary chamber, where the walls were lined with rows of alabaster jars containing the essence of the world. He would grind dried minerals into fine powders with a rhythmic sound of stone against stone, a sound that was as steady and hypnotic as the falling rain. He mixed the resin of the cedar tree with the oil of the castor bean, observing how the different textures blended together to create a balm that could soften the hardest skin and soothe the weary muscles of the palace guards. He believed that nature never produced an illness without also providing a remedy, if only one had the patience to look beneath the surface and listen to the whispers of the wind. He taught his assistants that the timing of the harvest was as important as the medicine itself, for some plants held their power in the dew of the morning, while others only revealed their secrets under the full light of the moon. He recorded the use of garlic and onions to strengthen the blood of the laborers who built the great monuments, ensuring that their bodies remained as resilient as the limestone blocks they moved. He saw the divinity in the simple mold that grew on bread, using it to treat the infections of the skin long before the world understood the secrets of the hidden life within the air. The room was filled with the gentle clinking of glass and the soft rustle of dried herbs being sorted into bundles, a symphony of small sounds that signaled the presence of order and care. He wrote on long scrolls of papyrus about the cooling properties of aloe and the warming energy of cinnamon, creating a map of the natural world that any healer could follow to find the path of health. His voice was a low and comforting hum as he explained to a worried mother how a poultice of crushed dates and wheat could settle the stomach of a child, making the world feel like a place of abundance and safety rather than one of scarcity and fear. He watched the way the light filtered through the jars of colored oils, creating patterns of emerald and amber on the floor, and he felt a deep connection to the spirit of the earth that provided such beauty and utility in equal measure. He was a master of balance, knowing that too much of a remedy could be as harmful as too little, and he taught the importance of moderation in all things, from the food one ate to the dreams one followed. He spent his nights reflecting on the relationship between the soil and the soul, realizing that a body nourished by the bounty of the land was a body that could stand firm against the storms of time. The silence of the pharmacy was a sanctuary where the chaos of the city faded away into a meditative focus on the healing power of the green world. He walked through the fields of flax and barley, feeling the life force pulsing through the stalks, and he knew that he was part of a great cycle of growth.
The upper levels of the rising pyramid, looking at the constellations and ensuring that the corners were aligned with the four directions of the world so that the structure would remain a beacon of order in a chaotic universe. The scent of the desert was clean and sharp, and the silence of the high plateau provided a sanctuary for his meditations on the nature of permanence and the legacy of a soul. He saw the step pyramid not just as a tomb, but as a machine for transcendence, a way for the spirit to climb from the dust of the valley to the light of the eternal stars. He designed the surrounding complex with courtyards and chapels that echoed the rhythm of his healing gardens, creating a space where the living and the dead could meet in a state of tranquil harmony. His hands were often covered in the fine white dust of the limestone, which he wore like a badge of honor, for he was a builder of worlds and a shaper of destiny. The process was slow and deliberate, like the rising of the Nile or the growth of an ancient tree, and he found beauty in the steady progress of each day's labor.
He taught the workers to find the center of their own gravity as they pulled the heavy sleds, making the work a form of moving meditation that unified the strength of the many into the vision of the one. The air was still, and the world was quiet as the final stones were placed at the summit, creating a silhouette that changed the face of the earth forever. Imhotep stood at the base of the finished masterpiece and felt the weight of the mountain he had created, yet his own spirit felt as light as a feather, for he had proven that stone could be made to dream. He breathed in the cooling air of the twilight and watched as the first stars appeared above the peak of the pyramid, feeling a connection to the future that was as solid as the rock beneath his feet. The legacy of Saqqara was a promise that human genius could conquer the decay of the physical world and leave a mark that would speak to the generations of the distant future in a language of silence and stone. He had built a ladder for a king, but in doing so he had built a monument for all of humanity, a symbol of the heights we can reach when we move with purpose and peace. The desert night wrapped the pyramid in a blanket of silver light, and the world settled into a deep and satisfied sleep, knowing that the first wonder of the world had been born from the mind of a man who listened to the stones and understood the stars. The silence of the plateau was now a living thing, vibrating with the energy of 1,000 years of history yet to come, and Imhotep was at the center of it all, a quiet genius of the earth who had turned a revolution in stone into an eternal hymn of architectural grace. In the quiet cool of the late Egyptian evening, when the shadows of the great pillars at Saqqara stretched like long, dark fingers across the courtyard, Imhotep sat in a state of deep reflection, considering the remarkable similarities between the stone monuments he built for the king and the living monuments that were the bodies of men. He realized that the same principles of balance and tension and structural integrity that kept the step pyramid standing against the weight of the ages were also the hidden laws that governed the human frame. He began to view the spine not just as a part of the body, but as the central pillar of a sacred temple, a vertical axis that must be aligned with the precision of a plumb line to ensure that the spirit could dwell comfortably within the flesh. His mind traveled through the architecture of the skeleton, seeing the pelvis as a sturdy foundation and the ribs as the protective vaulting of a sanctuary that shielded the precious mysteries of the heart and lungs. He sat in a meditative silence, listening to the soft rustle of the palms and the distant rhythmic chanting of the evening priests, feeling the interconnectedness of all structures, whether made of limestone or bone. He understood that when a stone in a wall is displaced, the entire building suffers a shift in its weight, and so it was with the body. Of his own being vibrating in resonance with the earth and the heavens, he was at peace with the knowledge that he had uncovered a fundamental truth of existence, that all things are built upon the same sacred laws of geometry and grace. The silence of the night was a blessing, and the promise of the dawn was a light that would continue to shine through the work of his hands and the vision of his mind for all time. In the soft lavender light of a cooling Egyptian evening where the shadows of the palm trees stretched across the courtyard like long dark ribbons, Imhotep sat near a quiet fountain and observed the simple movement of water as it flowed over the smooth limestone lip and into the basin below. He realized in that moment of profound stillness that the secret to a long life was not found in the complexity of a cure, but in the simplicity of the beginning, and that the purity of the water was the first step toward the purity of the body. He began to see that health was a state of grace that could be maintained through the daily rituals of washing and the careful selection of the food that entered the temple of the flesh. He moved his gaze to the laborers who were finishing their day, and he thought of how the dust of the earth could carry the seeds of sickness if it was not cleared away with the same regularity that a priest clears the altar before a prayer. He began to teach the people of Memphis that to be clean was to be close to the divine, and that the act of scrubbing one's hands with the alkaline salts of the desert was a sacred duty that protected the life force from the invisible decay of the world. He spoke in a low and melodic voice that felt like the steady pulse of the river, explaining that the water we drink must be as clear as the eye of a hawk, and that the air we breathe must be allowed to circulate freely through the high windows of our homes. His mind was a sanctuary of order as he designed the first systems of drainage and waste removal for the palace, seeing the city as a living organism that required its own internal hygiene to remain strong and vibrant.
He spent his afternoons recording these principles on long scrolls of fine papyrus, emphasizing the importance of linen that was bleached white by the sun, and the use of copper vessels that kept the water sweet and cool, even in the height of the summer heat. He was a pioneer of the quiet intervention, believing that it was far better to prevent a shadow from falling than to struggle to chase it away once it had arrived. He looked at the herbs in his garden not just as remedies for the sick, but as daily companions for the healthy, using the scent of mint to clear the mind and the strength of garlic to fortify the blood against the seasonal winds. There was no rush in his philosophy, as he believed that life should move at the pace of a slow-growing tree, rooted in the steady habits of a disciplined mind and a clean environment. The air in his presence was always calm and carried the faint aroma of cedar and soda, which he used to purify the spaces where people gathered to talk and to dream. He taught the court physicians that the first question to ask a patient was not where it hurt, but how they had lived and what they had touched, and whether they had honored the laws of cleanliness that governed the natural world. He saw the divinity in the mundane acts of shaving the head and trimming the nails and bathing in the cooling flow of the Nile, seeing these as the external expressions of an internal commitment to balance and truth. His rise to the position of a demigod of healing began with these simple observations that linked the physical state of the man to the spiritual state of the kingdom. He sat for many hours watching the sunset over the western cliffs, thinking about the thousands of years of human history and how many lives could be saved by the simple act of keeping the water pure and the food covered from the flies that carried the weight of the desert's heat. He was the architect of a new way of living, where the prevention of disease was the highest form of medicine and the maintenance of the body was the most important work of the day. His hands were always clean, and his robes were always white, serving as a silent example of the holiness he preached to the kings and the commoners alike. He believed that the soul could only rest in a body that was as tidy and well kept as a royal archives, and that the clarity of one's thoughts was a direct reflection of the clarity of one's surroundings. As the stars began to appear in the velvet sky, like points of life on a vast celestial map, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was teaching the world to protect itself through the wisdom of hygiene and the grace of order. The night was long, and the silence was a blanket that wrapped the city in a sense of security, for the people knew that their vizier was watching over the very air they breathed and the water they drank. He closed his eyes and felt the rhythm of his own steady breathing, realizing that the harmony of the universe was found in the balance of the elements and the purity of the spirit. He was at rest with the knowledge that his legacy would not be measured in the height of his pyramids, but in the health of the children who grew up strong because they lived in a world where cleanliness was the first law of life. The quiet of the night was a blessing, and the scent of the
long bandages of fine linen that had been soaked in a mixture of honey and resin to create a casing that was both firm and protective. As he worked, the sounds of the desert would fade into a soft hum, and the only reality was the steady pulse of the patient in the cool texture of the bandages as they were layered one upon another in a spiral of healing. He recorded these methods on his scrolls with the same precision he used for his architectural blueprints, drawing the exact way a knot should be tied and how the weight of the limb should be supported to prevent the muscles from pulling the bone out of its sacred alignment. He saw the divinity in the way the body would eventually fuse the break, leaving behind a mark of strength that was often greater than the original bone, and he marveled at the resilience of the human machine under his care. He was the first to realize that the mind must be kept at peace for the body to focus its energy on the repair, and so he spoke in low melodic tones that lulled the injured into a state of quiet acceptance and rest. The air in the infirmary was always thick with the scent of cedar oil, which acted as a shield against the heavy air of the valley, and the room was kept in a state of soft dimness to encourage the deep sleep that is the foundation of all recovery. He watched the moon rise over the rising tiers of the step pyramid and thought of how the stones of the tomb and the bones of the man were both subject to the laws of balance and gravity, and how his role was simply to be the servant of those laws. He would sit for hours by the bedside of a mending worker, watching the rhythm of their breath and knowing that beneath the linen bandages, the silent miracle of reconstruction was taking place without the need for magic or loud incantations. He believed that the healer's hands were the instruments of a higher order, and that every successful setting of a bone was a victory for the light of reason over the darkness of fear. His reputation grew not just for his skill, but for the immense patience he brought to the slow process of healing, for he knew that stone and bone both require time to settle and find their strength once again. He moved through the wards like a cooling breeze, touching a forehead here and adjusting a splint there, always with a sense of purpose that was never hurried or anxious. He taught that a healer must be like the Nile itself, steady and unceasing in its flow, providing what is needed without ever demanding more than the land can give. The nights were long and peaceful under his watch, and the workers of the Third Dynasty slept with the confidence that if they fell, the hands of Imhotep would be there to catch them and make them whole again. He closed his eyes and felt the structural integrity of his own life, reflecting on the hundreds of limbs he had saved and the thousands of steps that were taken because he had understood the geometry of the skeleton. The silence of the Egyptian night was a testament to his work, a world where the broken could be mended and the weak could be made strong through the power of observation and the grace of a steady heart. He breathed in the scent of the desert sand and the cooling stones of the palace, feeling a deep connection to the earth that provided both the challenge of the trauma and the bounty of the cure. He was the master of the mending art, a genius of the physical realm, who turned the pain of the moment into the peace of a lifetime of health. As the stars twinkled in their eternal positions, he allowed himself to drift into a state of quietude, satisfied that the day's work had contributed to the lasting harmony of the kingdom and the well-being of its people. The world was quiet, and the rhythm of the night was a slow and steady beat that promised a tomorrow where every man could stand tall and walk with a firm.
Was a master of the invisible world, navigating the narrow path between life and decay with a clarity of purpose that changed the history of his people. He saw the beauty in the way a clean wound knitted itself back together, leaving a silver scar that was a mark of a battle won through wisdom and patience. His approach to infection was a revolution of logic that replaced the fear of the unknown with the certainty of the observable truth, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched the death rate of the royal laborers drop with the introduction of his new laws of hygiene. He believed that every human being was a temple that deserved to be kept in a state of perfect preservation, and he spent his life ensuring that the silent killer would no longer have a place to hide within the walls of Memphis. As the moon climbed high and cast a pale silver light over the silent pyramids, he sat on his terrace and felt the cool breeze on his face, knowing that he had given his people a weapon of knowledge against the shadows. The silence of the night was a gift, and the rhythm of his own breathing was a reminder that life is a delicate balance that must be guarded with a steady hand and a clear mind. He closed his eyes and allowed the peace of the Egyptian night to wrap around him like a soft linen cloak, satisfied that his work with the resins and the salts and the molds had created a legacy of health that would endure for generations. The world was safe, and the world was quiet, and the genius of the first physician was a light that would never be extinguished by the darkness of the past. In the deep and velvet shadows of the royal palace at Memphis, where the air was always cool and carried the faint regal scent of blue lotus and aged cedar, Imhotep moved with a quiet grace as the personal guardian of King Djoser's vitality. He was not merely a servant of the crown, but the architect of the king's physical longevity, ensuring that the leader of Egypt remained as steady and enduring as the limestone monuments rising in the desert. Every morning, before the sun broke over the horizon and painted the Nile in hues of liquid amber, Imhotep would enter the royal chambers with a rhythmic and soft tread that never disturbed the lingering echoes of the night. He observed the king's sleep with a clinical eye, watching the rise and fall of the royal chest and the relaxation of the brow,
for he knew that the health of the pharaoh was the health of the entire nation. He believed that the body of a king was a sacred vessel that required a precise balance of rest and movement and nourishment, and he managed every detail of the pharaoh's day with a meditative focus that allowed no room for haste or anxiety. He would prepare the king's morning tonic using the purest water from the high springs, mixed with a touch of honey and the strengthening properties of the sycamore fruit, while explaining in a low, melodic voice how each element served to align the royal spirit with the rising sun. He treated the pharaoh not as a distant god, but as a human machine of immense complexity that faced the same burdens of stress and age as any man, and his presence provided a sanctuary of calm amidst the loud debates of the viziers and the political weight of the court. He was a master of preventive care, creating a daily regimen of stretching and bathing in the cooling pools of the palace gardens to keep the king's joints as fluid as the river and his mind as sharp as a scribe's reed. He monitored the royal diet with the scrutiny of a priest, ensuring that only the cleanest grains and the freshest vegetables reached the king's table to prevent the heaviness of spirit that comes from a burdened stomach. Whenever the king felt the shadow of a headache or the stiffness of a long day on the throne, Imhotep would apply his knowledge of the pulse and the pressure points, using his steady hands to release the tension and restore the flow of life through the king's limbs. He recorded every observation.
Civilizations had found their voices. He became the silent teacher of the world. A man whose name was whispered in the libraries of Alexandria and the temples of the Aegean as the true father of the healing arts. His transition from a man of flesh to a demigod of medicine was a slow and natural progression, driven by the undeniable truth of his observations and the lasting peace that his methods brought to the suffering. He saw the ink as a bridge across the abyss of the forgotten, a way to whisper into the ears of students yet unborn about the importance of cleanliness and the structural integrity of the frame and the sacred duty to do no harm. The air in the archives was still, and the world outside was quiet as the ink dried in the gentle warmth of the evening light, creating a record of a mind that had mastered the complexity of the machine and the simplicity of the soul. He envisioned a future where his scrolls would be found and decoded by people who lived in cities of glass and light, and he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that the foundation he had laid was deep enough to support the weight of all human progress. He was the first to realize that knowledge is the only true immortality, and that by sharing his genius, he was ensuring that the light of reason would never truly go out, even in the darkest of ages. The scrolls were wrapped in fine linen and stored in jars of alabaster, waiting for the hands of the curious and the hearts of the brave to find them and carry the torch of medicine forward through the long corridors of history. His handwriting was a map of his own tranquility, a reflection of a life lived in perfect harmony with the laws of Mot and the movements of the celestial bodies. He sat back and watched the moon rise over the palm groves of Memphis, feeling the weight of the pen leave his fingers and the weight of the future rest easily upon his shoulders. He was at peace with the passing of time, because he had turned his time into a gift for all of humanity, a legacy in ink that would travel further than any pharaoh's chariot and last longer than any empire's gold. The night was long, and the silence was profound, as the spirit of the first recorded genius merged with the very air of Egypt, becoming a part of the eternal landscape that continues to inspire the dreamers and the healers of today. He closed his eyes and felt the rhythmic pulse of the world, a pulse he had been the first to name and understand, and he drifted into a dreamless sleep, knowing that his work was finished and his story was just beginning to be told across the vast and silent stretches of the coming millennia. The world was quiet and the stars were bright, and the ink was permanent as the legacy of Imhotep became the heartbeat of a more enlightened world, where the mind and the body could finally find their way home to the light. As the centuries flowed like the slow and heavy silt of the Nile, the memory of the man named Imhotep began to undergo a soft and luminous transformation,
moving from the records of history into the eternal realm of the divine, where the boundaries between the mortal and the immortal are as thin as the morning mist over the river. He had lived a life of such profound balance and quiet brilliance that the people of Egypt could no longer see him as a mere architect or a physician, but began to view him as a direct conduit to the healing power of the universe itself. The transition was not sudden or loud, but developed with the steady rhythm of a growing forest, as stories of his wisdom were whispered from mother to child and from teacher to student, until his name became a prayer for those in pain and a beacon for those in darkness. In the quiet courtyards of Memphis and the sacred precincts of Saqqara, small altars began to appear, where people would leave offerings of cool water and fresh lotus flowers, not to a distant and terrifying god, but to the gentle sage who had once walked among them with a reed pen.
God continued to flow through the hearts of the dreamers and the healers of every age. In the quiet cooling of the centuries, where the golden sands of Egypt met the deep, azure waters of the Mediterranean, a new rhythm began to echo through the halls of history as the wisdom of the ancient East drifted slowly toward the rising light of the West. The name of Imhotep, which had been carved into the stones of Memphis for thousands of years, began to travel across the waves on the breath of the sea breeze, reaching the sun-drenched shores of Greece, where the scholars and healers were searching for a logic to explain the mysteries of the human frame. Here, the Greeks had their own master of the healing arts, a figure named Asclepius, who carried a staff entwined with a serpent, symbolizing the shedding of the old skin and the renewal of life. But when the travelers and the philosophers of the Hellenistic age stepped onto the fertile soil of the Nile, they recognized in the temples of Imhotep a spirit that was identical to their own. They saw the same calm eyes looking out from the bronze statues and felt the same profound silence in the chambers of incubation, where the sick came to dream of their recovery under the watchful gaze of the master. They began to speak of the two as one single eternal force of healing, merging the architecture of the Egyptian mind with the poetry of the Greek soul, in a union that felt as natural as the meeting of the river and the sea. The air in the temples of Alexandria was thick with the scent of both Egyptian kefi and Greek laurel, creating a sanctuary where the past and the future merged into a continuous present of peaceful discovery. The Greeks called him Imhotep, and they looked upon his scrolls not as foreign mysteries, but as the foundational blueprints of all rational thought, seeing the way he had mapped the pulse and the bones with a precision that predated their own logic by 2,000 years. The transition was a slow and rhythmic blending of cultures, where the rigid lines of the desert met the fluid curves of the marble islands, and the silence of the pyramid met the music of the lyre, in a harmony that lulled the world into a state of intellectual tranquility. They shared the belief that a healer must first be a philosopher who understands the movement of the stars and the balance of the elements, and they found that Imhotep had mastered these connections while the world was still young and quiet. As the moon rose over the harbor of Alexandria, casting a silver path across the water that linked the two civilizations, the scholars would sit in the cool library and compare the ancient papyrus with the new parchment, finding that the truth of the heart and the logic of the anatomy remained unchanged by time or geography. This connection created a bridge of light across the Mediterranean, allowing the genius of the Third Dynasty to flow into the veins of the Western world, ensuring that the light of Imhotep's reason would never be extinguished by the shadows of the falling empires. The people of this new age would come to the shrines of the merged deity, seeking the same balance of Mot the Djoser had sought, and they would find it in the quiet administration of the remedies and the steady presence of the healing dreams. The world felt smaller and more connected in this era of shared wisdom, where the borders between gods and men and between nations began to dissolve into a single story of human progress and compassion. The nights were long and filled with the soft sound of the waves hitting the stone quays, a rhythmic pulse that reminded the thinkers of the heartbeat that Imhotep had first documented in the dim light of his dim study.
They realized that the human machine was the same, whether it stood under the palms of Egypt or the olives of Greece, and that the art of medicine was a universal language that required a steady hand and a heart at peace. The legacy of the Hellenistic connection was a promise that the wisdom of the ancestors would always find a home in the minds of the curious.
The transition from the Egyptian master to the Greek sage was like the transition from the heavy silence of the night to the soft and certain light of the morning, where the mysteries of the body were slowly and patiently revealed to those who had the courage to observe and the patience to listen. We feel the weight of their combined wisdom as a comforting blanket that wraps around the history of our species, providing a sense of security and a promise of health through the application of the rational mind. Imhotep's legacy was the stone in the ink, the solid foundation upon which all future science would be built, while Hippocrates provided the voice and the spirit that gave that science its human heart and its moral compass. As the stars continue their slow and majestic rotation over the silent ruins of Memphis and the quiet groves of Kos, we realize that it does not matter who carries the title of father, for both were the guardians of our breath and the protectors of our vitality. They both taught us to breathe deeply and to find the center of our own gravity and to trust in the steady and unceasing flow of life that moves through us all like the eternal river. The silence of the night is a testament to their work, a world where we can rest in the knowledge that the logic of the body has been understood and the pathway to healing has been cleared by the genius of those who came before us. The air is cool and the world is at peace as the spirit of Imhotep and the vision of Hippocrates merge into a single and beautiful melody of human progress and quiet discovery. We are the children of their observations and the beneficiaries of their dedicated lives, standing on the shoulders of giants who looked into the darkness and saw only the light of the truth. The night grows deeper, and the rhythm of our own heartbeats becomes a soft and reassuring echo of the thousands of pulses they once felt with their own steady hands. We are safe in the hands of history, and we are calm in the presence of such enduring wisdom as we drift into a dreamless and restorative sleep, guided by the twin lights of the Egyptian architect and the Greek physician, who together gave us the gift of medicine and the grace of understanding. In the quiet shadows of the great museums and the silent dust of the ancient archives, there began a slow and rhythmic awakening as the scholars of a new age turned their eyes toward the intricate carvings of the Egyptian past and sought to unlock the secrets that had been held in a state of suspended animation for thousands of years. The world had long forgotten the true depth of the man named Imhotep, seeing him only as a phantom of myth or a distant god of stone, until the steady and patient hands of the decipherers began to peel away the layers of time with the same care he once used to unwrap a linen bandage. They looked upon the walls of the temples where the hieroglyphs marched in perfect rows like the silent soldiers of a lost era, and they felt the first stirrings of a profound realization as the symbols for the heart and the lungs and the brain began to reveal a medical genius that was far ahead of its time. The process was a slow and meditative journey through the desert of the mind, where the scratching of the scholar's pen matched the ancient scratching of the scribe's reed, creating a bridge of sound that spanned the vastness of the centuries. As the meanings of the sacred carvings began to emerge from the silence, they found not the spells of magicians, but the observations of a scientist who had mapped the human body with the precision of an architect and the compassion of a healer. They discovered descriptions of the brain's membranes and the rhythmic pulse of the heart and the systematic treatment of trauma that read like a modern manual for a quiet infirmary. The air in the libraries was still and carried the faint scent of old paper and sun-baked stone, providing a sanctuary for the rediscovery of a logic that had once kept an empire healthy and strong. And spiritual faith were not separate paths, but a single flowing river of understanding that guided the weary toward a state of total restoration. The sanctuary was a place of limestone courtyards and cool shaded porticos,
where the scent of blue lotus and burning frankincense drifted on the gentle breeze, creating a cocoon of safety that protected the suffering from the noise and heat of the outside world. Imhotep had designed this space with the same architectural precision he applied to the king's tomb, knowing that a body cannot truly mend if the mind is not first anchored in a state of absolute quietude and trust. Patients would arrive at the heavy stone gates with the weight of their ailments visible in their eyes, and they would be greeted by the rhythmic sound of water flowing from sacred springs, which served as a constant reminder of the purity and renewal that were the foundations of the healing arts. The priests and healers who walked these halls moved with a slow and deliberate grace, their white linen robes rustling softly against the polished floors as they prepared the tinctures of honey and the ointments of copper that Imhotep had documented in his sacred scrolls. Within the heart of the sanctuary were the chambers of incubation, where the practice of dream healing took place, a tradition that merged the logic of the physician with the mystery of the divine in a way that lulled the spirit into a deep and dreamless sleep. A person seeking health would lie upon a bed of fresh reeds in a room where the light was soft and filtered through high, narrow windows, and they would allow their breath to become slow and rhythmic, matching the steady pulse of the desert night, as they waited for a vision of the master healer to guide them toward the source of their recovery. There was no fear in this darkness, only a sense of profound belonging to a world that was governed by the laws of Ma'at and the compassion of a genius who saw the divinity in every heartbeat and every breath. Imhotep believed that faith was the internal architecture that held the spirit upright while the physical body performed its quiet masonry of repair, and he taught that the healer must address the shadow in the mind as carefully as the wound in the flesh. The sanctuary was filled with small shrines where the light of a single oil lamp would flicker gently against the carvings of the human machine, showing the brain and the heart and the limbs in a state of perfect balance and health. As the moon climbed over the peak of the pyramid, casting a silver glow over the silent courtyards, the healers would gather to chant in low melodic tones that resonated through the stone walls, creating a frequency of calm that seemed to slow the passage of time itself. They understood that the body is a temple of the sun, and that the sanctuary at Saqqara was the place where that sun could be rekindled after the long winter of an illness or the sudden storm of a trauma. The water used in the rituals was kept in alabaster jars to remain cool and sweet, and every meal served within the walls was a meditation on the bounty of the earth and the importance of simplicity in the preservation of life. People from all walks of life, from the humble laborers of the quarries to the high officials of the court, would find themselves equal in the eyes of the sanctuary, for the laws of anatomy and the needs of the soul are universal and unchanging. The silence of the desert night was a blessing that wrapped the sanctuary in a blanket of security, allowing the patients to drift into the deep restorative slumber that is the first and greatest of all medicines. Even the birds in the palm groves seemed to hush their songs when the sun dipped below the horizon, as if the entire natural world was participating in the sacred work of quietude and healing that took place at Saqqara. The legacy.
Treat each breath as a sacred event that connects us to the history of all who have ever walked this earth in search of light and health. The lesson of Imhotep for the modern soul is one of profound simplicity, a call to return to the center of our own being and to honor the silent machinery of the flesh with the same reverence we give to the most magnificent monuments of stone. He tells us that the future of medicine is not found only in the new, but in the rediscovery of the ancient truth that we are part of a larger harmony, and that to be whole is to be in agreement with the world around us. The air is cool and the night is long, and the spirit of the first physician wraps around us like a soft linen cloak, providing a sense of security that transcends the boundaries of time and the limits of our own understanding. He encourages us to close our eyes and let go of the burdens of the day, feeling the weight of the earth beneath us and the vastness of the sky above us as we drift into a state of deep and restorative peace. The silence of the night is his final gift to us, a vessel for the dreaming mind, where the wisdom of the past and the potential of the future merge into a single and beautiful melody of existence. We are safe in the legacy of his thoughts, and we are calm in the shadow of his genius as we allow ourselves to sink into the quiet rhythm of a dreamless sleep, guided by the steady hand of the man who first taught the world to heal. The journey is complete, and the path is clear, and the dawn will bring a new day of health and clarity for all who have listened to the whispers of the architect and the physician who turned the dust of the desert into the light of the soul. The world is at rest, and the stars are watchful, and the heart of humanity continues to beat with the steady and healthy rhythm that Imhotep first named so very long ago. In the deep and silvered silence of the Saqqara Plateau, where the golden dunes ripple like a frozen sea under the watchful gaze of the eternal stars, there lies a secret hidden beneath the limestone dust and the weight of 5,000 years of shifting sands. It is the mystery of the missing tomb of the master architect and healer Imhotep, whose final resting place has eluded the seekers and the dreamers of every generation since the days of the pharaohs. The desert holds its breath in a state of profound tranquility, as if it were guarding a sacred treasure that is meant to be felt rather than found, and the wind whispers through the empty courtyards of the step pyramid, carrying the faint scent of ancient cedar and the memory of a genius who once walked these very paths with a mind full of geometry and grace. Scholars and explorers have spent lifetimes wandering through the labyrinthian tunnels and the subterranean chambers of the necropolis, searching for a doorway or a seal that would lead them to the sanctuary of the first physician. But the earth remains as silent as the stone sarcophagi that lined the halls of the Serapeum. Some believe that he was laid to rest in a modest chamber, hidden deep within the bedrock, far below the reach of the sun, where the cool air of the underworld provides an eternal sanctuary for the soul of the builder, while others imagine a magnificent temple buried beneath the dunes, filled with the alabaster jars of his medicines and the papyrus scrolls of his wisdom. There is a rhythmic peace in the search itself, a steady and meditative process of excavation, where every grain of sand moved is a step closer to the heart of a legend, and every sunset over the western cliffs brings a sense of quietude and reflection on the nature of a life that was so grand it required the desert to keep its secrets. As the moon climbs high over the silent monuments, casting long and velvet shadows across the landscape of the dead, the seekers sit by their fires and dream of the day the sand will finally yield the path to the master's final rest. But the mystery only grows deeper and more beautiful with the passing of the hours. It is as if Imhotep himself designed his disappearance with the same precision he used for the king's tomb, ensuring that his physical form would merge with the very soil of Egypt and become a part of the eternal landscape he loved so well. The missing tomb is not a void but a presence, a spirit of curiosity and wonder that animates the plateau and encourages the world to keep looking for the light of reason amidst the shadows of the past. The seekers move with a slow and deliberate grace, respecting the silence of the site and the sacredness of the quest, knowing that to find Imhotep is to find the origin of our own desire to heal and to understand the machine of the body. The air in the desert night is crisp and clean, carrying the fragrance of the distant Nile and the cooling stones of the old ruins, providing a cocoon of safety for those who spend their nights contemplating the location of the hidden door. Perhaps the tomb is not a place of stone at all, but a state of mind, a legacy of thought that lives on in every hospital and every library, where the pursuit of health is honored as a divine calling. The desert night is long and kind, and the silence is a blanket that wraps the world in a sense of security, while the stars continue their slow and majestic dance above the missing tomb of the architect. He remains the silent shadow of Saqqara, the unseen guide who whispers to the weary to rest and to the curious to keep dreaming of the wonders that lie beneath the surface of the visible world.
The mystery is a symphony of stillness that lulls the heart.
That same honey, to find it, creates a natural barrier that keeps the decay at bay and draws the moisture from the air to heal the skin in a way that mirrors the wisdom of the Old Kingdom. He spoke of the bark of the willow tree to pull the heat from a fevered brow, and now we understand the salicylic acid that flows within those branches as the ancestor of the very medicine we take today to quiet the throbbing of our own heads and find the path back to a cool and restful state. As the sun sets over the modern skyline and the world begins to slow its pace to the steady rhythm of the evening breeze, we find a deep sense of security in knowing that the foundation of our medicine was laid by a hand that was as gentle as it was wise. The air in the research halls is still and carries a faint scent of sterile cleanliness, which blends with the memory of the cedar and myrrh that Imhotep used to purify the air of his infirmaries in Memphis, providing a sanctuary for the mind to wander through the centuries and see the connection between the ancient poultice and the modern bandage. He used the moldy bread of the storehouse to treat the infections of the flesh, and today we recognize the hidden life within that mold as the precursor to the greatest discoveries of the 20th century, proving that the silent killer he fought with such patience was always destined to be conquered by the logic he first set in motion. There is no hurry in this validation, but rather a slow and meditative unfolding of truth, where the ancient symbols for the heart and the lungs are found to correspond perfectly with the modern maps of the cardiovascular system, showing that the human machine has always been a masterpiece of biological engineering that responds to the same natural laws regardless of the era. The scholars and the doctors sit in the quietude of their libraries and feel a sense of profound belonging to a lineage of healers that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization, guided by the steady pulse of Imhotep's reason and the enduring grace of his compassion. We see the validation of his remedies as a promise that the earth has always provided what we need to sustain our lives, and that the genius of the past is a light that continues to shine through the complexities of the future. The night is long, and the silence is a gift that allows us to reflect on the beauty of a life dedicated to the observation of the small things, like the flow of a pulse or the texture of a leaf, which contain the secrets of the entire universe within their humble forms. As the moon moves across the velvet sky, casting a silver glow over the silent cities, we feel the weight of our own bodies, finding a state of harmony with the world around us, just as the patients of the Step Pyramid Sanctuary once felt the cooling touch of the Master's hand. The science of today is the echo of the wisdom of yesterday, and the two are one single and continuous melody of human progress that sings of a world where we are safe, and we are understood, and we are mended by the steady application of the truth. The quiet of the night is a blessing that wraps us in a blanket of historical certainty, where the shadows of ignorance are chased away by the bright and certain light of the validated remedy. He was the first to realize that nature is a pharmacy and the body is a temple, and his lessons are as fresh and vital today as they were when the ink was still wet on the papyrus in the library of Memphis. We drift into a deep and restorative sleep, knowing that the legacy of Imhotep is not a museum piece, but a living force that guides the hands of every surgeon and the mind of every researcher who seeks to protect the flame of life. The world is at rest, and the desert is quiet, and the bridge between the ancient and the modern is solid and strong, providing a path of peace for all who walk the earth in search of health and longevity. The rhythm of the stars and the rhythm of the
The world had learned to listen. He is the eternal architect because he built a bridge between the mortal and the divine, using nothing but the strength of his own reason and the grace of his own heart, and that bridge is still standing for all of us to cross whenever we seek the sanctuary of the truth. The desert is quiet, and the world is at rest, and the name of Imhotep is a soft and rhythmic melody that lulls us into a state of absolute security and peace, where the boundaries of the past and the present dissolve into a single and beautiful eternity of sleep. He is the guardian of our rest and the builder of our dreams, a man whose genius was so vast that it became a permanent part of the celestial architecture of the cosmos. We are safe in the shadow of his legacy, and we are calm in the presence of his enduring wisdom, as the stars continue their silent dance and the moon watches over the silent stones of his greatest work. The night is long, and the silence is a blessing. In the story of the man who outlived the pyramids is a hymn of hope that will continue to play in the hearts of humanity until the end of time. Sleep now in the knowledge that the foundation is strong and the architect is watchful, and the light of his reason will always be there to guide you back to the dawn of a new and healthy day.